Puzzles. I've never been very good at them. Perhaps it's due to my lack of attention span, or perhaps it has something more to do with my determination to take pieces that I think should fit but don't and trying to jam them into place. Yet I realize, for all of my lack of puzzle aptitude, the truth can be a lot like a puzzle. It is not found in a single piece or even in a group of pieces that fit together. Until the entire puzzle has been completed, we cannot see the full picture. In the spirit of this illustration, I want to take this time to piece together at least a portion of the puzzle so the truth may be seen and therefore understood more clearly. There is a disconnect between religion and science with regards to our history and certainly the present reality. This is nothing new. One could point back to the Dark Ages and the death grip of power and control used by the Catholic Church to keep people in ignorance and them in a place of intellectual and moral superiority. They not only controlled a man in life, but declared themselves to have complete control in a person's eternal destination. This kind of abuse of power ultimately led to brave Protestant pioneers stepping forward to challenge the Pope and his minions on the matter of religious truth. In the same period of time, men of science, whether religious or not, began to challenge the Roman Catholics regarding the true nature of creation and our history. The Bible, which Catholics had controlled both in print and in language, began to spring forth both from the standpoint of availability and understanding. Likewise, science began to disprove the wives' tales and superstition that had been taught over the course of hundreds of years. Yet as time progressed, there was an ever-widening gap between science and the Christian religion. One of the critical points in our more recent history was the theory brought forth by Charles Darwin, a theory we know as evolution. This single theory and all of its subsets such as natural selection, branching patterns, and transmutation of species revolutionized the world and even seemingly dislodged the time-held belief of a creator and an intelligent design. I will not be discussing the theory of evolution in detail, as I expect that most watching this video already understand the basic tenets of its assertion. However, what needs to be stated is that this theory called into question all that had been believed prior to it. While the 7 days of creation as depicted in Genesis was known to most within the civilized world, his research concluded that we are some type of cosmic accident, which was the result of the quote-unquote Big Bang. This Big Bang is what set everything into motion. Or was it? This is one of the most widely debated topics of today. It calls into question not only how the planet we live on came to be, but even when it came into existence. While creationists or New Earthers believe the planet came into existence some 6,000 years ago, scientists have dated it at 4.6 billion years. There really couldn't be a much broader disconnect. But which is true? We can only come to a conclusion based on the facts and evidence. So this is where we will begin. The earliest written records of creation were penned by Moses. Although Moses is believed to have been born some 2,300 years after the biblical account of creation, or about 1393 BCE, according to Scripture, he was given a view of creation and relayed this account of history from the time of creation through the life of Adam, Enoch, Noah, Nimrod, Abraham, and many other biblical characters who predated him by hundreds and even thousands of years. Although there is a rich heritage of oral tradition among the Hebrew people, one could be left to ask, how accurate could his account be? Logically, one must view his account through the light of facts and evidence. Does his account of creation and early mankind align with documented proof? Many say even Moses is a mythical character, let alone what he wrote of. is there archaeological evidence to prove that the people and events he wrote of were true? While there are many historical events documented by Moses, there are two great catastrophes which are known to most: the Great Worldwide Flood and the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Are these just fables, or are they historical fact? Let's take a look together. The following is the account as found in Genesis, beginning in chapter 6, verse 9, and proceeding through chapter 8. I'm paraphrasing for the sake of brevity, but if you have not read the account, I suggest that you not take my word for it, but read it for yourself. According to the biblical account, God saw that the people of the earth were corrupted. In order to preserve a righteous remnant, he warned Noah of a coming worldwide flood. In essence, what we know as an extinction level event. In order to preserve mankind and each of the unique animals represented across the face of the earth, God instructed Noah to construct a large boat, commonly referred to as the ark, as the refuge for the coming judgment. God followed through as promised, and all of mankind and animal kind were wiped off the face of the earth, save those which had been loaded into the ark. Again, I am paraphrasing, as the point is not to discuss every detail, but examine the facts and evidence for a worldwide flood and for the ark itself. According to the biblical account, this took place in approximately 2348 BC. So is there concrete physical evidence to corroborate this catastrophic event? One may not tie the two together, but archaeology provides a scientific record by way of the coal shale. According to modern science, the coal shale is the result of dead plants and material being compressed over time by silt. As you will note in the pictures being shared, the coal shale occurs in a flat seam. Above it, you can clearly see material added over time. This is commonly referred to as stratification and is used to show a timeline. In this area, there is no disconnect between science and the biblical account. Where the disconnect occurs is regarding the time frame in which the coal shale was formed. Although the scientific community does not agree precisely, the estimations vary between 100 and 300 million years ago. Clearly, this cannot align with the Bible, as the creation narrative states that creation is just a little over 6,000 years old. So which is it? According to Darwin's theory, humans did not come into being on Earth until approximately 2.5 million years ago, and modern humans did not emerge until somewhere between 300 and 800,000 years ago. So if the scientific narrative is accurate, one must wonder how clear human evidence has been found in the coal shale throughout the world. That is a disconnect of at least 98 million years. However, the biblical narrative aligns perfectly with the coal shale, as we can easily conclude that a worldwide catastrophe destroying all the plants and animals would 1. Flatten everything, and 2. Stir up trillions of tons of silt that would ultimately settle on top of the massive layer of carbon-based life forms. These are just a few of many artifacts found, but don't take my word for it. Do your own research and you will find that this evidence is accurate. Again, it begs the question, why is it that all of these human artifacts are being discovered in the coal shale if the scientific record is accurate? Science has tried disputing these facts, but has utterly failed to do so. What about the ark itself? Surely a boat massive enough to carry 7 pairs of every clean animal and a pair of every unclean animal would stand out even after thousands of years of exposure to the elements, especially when we consider that it didn't sink to the bottom of the sea but came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, as recorded in Genesis chapter 8. Picture a large cruise liner on the side of a mountain, and it is pretty much what you would have. So there are 2 important elements. 1. This is a very large vessel, and 2. It came to rest in a very unnatural place where you wouldn't expect to see a dinghy, let alone a monstrosity such as described in Genesis chapter 6. This is what makes the finding of what is depicted in the background so remarkable. Secular science has railed against this discovery and has relentlessly refuted it. The question is, why? I invite you to do your own research, as I could not possibly cover the scope of the discovery and the evidence that has been corroborated by numerous archaeologists already. Some simply state, this is definitely a big boat, while others are certain that it is the Ark. The questions I find myself returning to repeatedly are, 1. If the archaeological evidence has clearly shown this to be a boat, how many boats of this size would one expect to find on the side of a mountain at over 6,000 feet in elevation? And 2, if it is not Noah's Ark, but clearly evidenced as a boat, why would they build it? It's not as though water levels in Turkey have ever reached anywhere near such a point. So either A, someone built a boat and left it there and it has never seen water, or B, there was a worldwide flood that caused this boat to come afloat and it came to rest in the mountains of Ararat, just as the biblical account records. This site was the subject of years of research. One of the most significant and telling pieces of evidence was the result of the GPR, or ground penetrating radar, which was used to map the area and provide evidence of what remains unseen beneath the earth. The object of the scans performed in this area was to determine if there was signs of a structure. As information was gathered, the entire structure was mapped out and is represented in the picture you see. The evidence spoke for itself, and it was confirmed by not just one, but numerous archaeologists. The structure that appeared was not the result of natural geology. The clear evidence was that this was a very large boat. Still, there was more to be discovered. Numerous artifacts were recovered during the scope of these scientific expeditions. This includes the petrified wood seen here, which was originally thought to be a single plank, but later was determined to be 3 separate pieces of wood fused together with an organic material, presumably pitch. This discovery has been verified by independent laboratories and ultimately debunks the retort from secular science that, as boat-like as the appearance is, it is still a natural formation. Yet there is more. This petrified wood has been shown to have nails still intact adjoining the wood as reinforcement. Modern construction often consists of plywood, since it is known to be much stronger than a single piece of wood. But this evidences that mankind was using this principle for construction even in pre-flood society. The evidence gets even more amazing with the discovery of an ancient fossilized rivet. This rivet was not primitive as science would have us believe of ancient mankind, but demonstrates that before the flood, men were engaged in metallurgy and the creating of alloys. Laboratory testing revealed a combination of iron, aluminum, and titanium as an alloy. Not only does this prove that these were man-made materials, but also that the pre-flood society was far more advanced than secular scientists have given credit for. Although the quality of this image is not the greatest, remember that it was taken many years ago. It is evident that the formations are not natural geology, but in fact evidence of planks of wood used in the construction of the hull of the Ark. By no means is this exhaustive research, but the combination of the 2 components, that of the artifacts in the coal shale and that of the Ark, bring to light 2 facts that cannot be discounted or ignored. First, that the timeline science has used to date the Earth is either inaccurate or contrived. And second, that the flood, which logically aligns with the period of time shown in the Bible, did in fact take place. So with this piece of the puzzle in place, let's move on to another major event documented within Moses' Genesis account, namely that of Sodom and Gomorrah, as found in Genesis chapter 19. Again, there is a disconnect between secular science and the biblical record of what occurred. According to Israel Finkelstein, an archaeologist from Tel Aviv University, in comment to the 1847 Lieutenant William Lynch expedition and subsequent discovery of a large Bronze Age city, long since destroyed, and continued studies of Steve Collins, we are probably dealing with an etiological story, that is, a legend that developed in order to explain a landmark. In other words, people who lived in the later phase of the Iron Age, the later days of the Kingdom of Judah, were familiar with the huge ruins of an early Bronze Age city and told a story of how such important places could be destroyed. In short, the story is just a wives' tale and lacks any real concrete evidence. Yet the widely regarded words of Josephus, an historian living in the 1st century, notes, "The land of Sodom, once rich in crops and in the wealth of its cities, but now dust and ashes. They say that owing to the impiety of its inhabitants, it was burnt up by lightning. Indeed, there are still marks of the fire from heaven, and the outlines of the 5 cities to be seen, and ashes still form a part of the growing fruits, which have all the appearance of eatable fruit, but when plucked with the hand dissolve into smoke and ashes. To this extent, the stories about the land of Sodom are confirmed by the evidence of our eyes." Excerpt from the Jewish War. The cities were located in the plain, so they should not have been located in the lowest area now covered by the Dead Sea. Considering that they were still evident in the 1st century AD, it stands to reason that they are still evident today. After all, the Dead Sea has been shrinking over the years, not expanding. Yet modern scientists state it is unable to be located and that the biblical account cannot be proven from a scientific perspective. Is this true, or is it possible that they wouldn't want the evidence of this biblical account to be substantiated? While I cannot definitively answer this question, it does cause one to wonder. Yet somehow it seems that the work of those the likes of Ron Wyatt has been overlooked. In fact, very little, if any, secular scientists have been willing to examine the true site of Sodom and Gomorrah as discovered and meticulously documented by his team. The geological formation depicted in the background shows the irregularities indicating metamorphic and earthquake activity. You can clearly see the layers with swirling in the bottom portion that is not due to normal stratification, but as the direct result of a cataclysmic event. Although this has the appearance of rock, this is ash that literally crumbles in your hand. One may be prompted to ask, what would cause such a large amount of ash to be there? I think the answer to that question is clear. Here we see a solid slab of sulfur crystals, which was created by a complete layer of brimstone that was burning beneath. As the sulfur burned, it turned into liquid, and as it cooled, the crystals were formed. Again, ask any scientist and they will have to agree that this can only be caused by extreme heat. This crystal shows a clear burn ring surrounding it, indicating that when it was embedded into the ash surrounding it, it was also on fire. Again, this appears to be a rock with many embedded pieces of sulfur in it. You can clearly see the burn rings and many of the spots where the burning sulfur was embedded as it was falling from the skies. Another of the telling aspects of this burning sulfur that literally rained down from the skies is the makeup of some of the ash itself. When analyzed, it was determined that the ash was composed of calcium sulfate and calcium carbonate, which are the byproducts of the burning sulfur coming into contact with the limestone that surely made up many of these city structures. The intense heat and the volume of the burning sulfur reduced the limestone to ash. This substantiates the raining of burning sulfur, but is there evidence of humans being present at the time of this supernatural event? The picture you see is concrete evidence of human presence at the time of the judgment. Note the human finger literally encased in sulfur. Clearly, humans were destroyed in the intense raining fire and ultimately covered with the ash. It is logical that the intensity of the heat literally incinerated many of the humans present, but in some cases, remnants of bone and even intact skeletons remain. So far, we have substantiated two major events as depicted in the Bible through three different sources of evidence. Yet these are only a few pieces of the puzzle that are being put together. Perhaps they are just a coincidence, right? I think not. Exodus chapter 14 bears the account of another supernatural event widely debated and now clearly substantiated by the evidence which remains. According to the biblical account, Pharaoh and his armies had the Hebrews penned against the shore of the Red Sea with literally no route of escape. But as this large force of chariots and horse-mounted warriors approached, Moses was told to raise his staff and stretch out his hand toward the sea. As he did, the seas literally parted, creating a path of dry ground with a wall of water on either side. Over the years, there have been many scientific theories put forth to explain away the Red Sea crossing, as science leaves off with facts and data and refuses to account for miraculous intervention. One of the most common of them is what I would call the Red Sea wading. According to this theory, the Hebrews waded through an area north of the Gulf of Suez while the tide was out. This clearly does not align with the biblical account for many reasons, but it causes one to wonder, why would science try to explain away by natural means something that it generally considers to be a fable in the first place? Of course, theories are considered for such a reason. They lack adequate facts and evidence to concretely substantiate the full facts. However, as I like to say, a man with a theory will never hold hostage a man with an experience. The theories of secular science have failed to maintain their position in the face of the facts. So how did the science community respond? Did they herald the evidence? No, they have attempted to silence the truth, as such an event defies all natural means of explanation. Moving on, let's examine the evidence. According to the biblical account, it is not just Israel that entered into the Red Sea. Pharaoh's armies subsequently entered the parted waters, but was swallowed up before they were able to make it through the vast expanse of the sea as it closed in around them. One would think that a large army meeting such a demise would leave behind evidence of their presence, and they did. The Gulf of Aqaba has become the location of numerous diving expeditions over the past 40 years. This 8-mile stretch from Nuweiba Beach has been proposed as the true Red Sea crossing site. The reason? It bears the signs of an underwater graveyard. Chariot wheels, intact axles, and even human remains have been documented and retrieved from this area. According to the team led by Professor Abdul Muhammad Gadar, who was associated with the Cairo University's Faculty of Archaeology, over 400 skeletons have been recovered along with weapons, pieces of armor, and the discovery of 2 war chariots over an area of approximately 200 square meters. Due to the depth of much of the area, it has been difficult to capture the extent of the ancient carnage, but Professor Gadar estimates that there are still skeletal remains of at least 5,000 more bodies and countless artifacts, further proving the Exodus account to be entirely accurate. One intriguing find was that of an Egyptian khopesh. This one, retrieved from the Red Sea, is on display at the Liberty Biblical Museum. It features the same build as the one recovered from King Tutankhamun's tomb. This weapon was used by royalty, and so its finding in the Red Sea shows that not only did an army enter the parted waters, but that among them were high-ranking Egyptian officials. The hub of this chariot wheel has also been compared to the hub of the six-spoked wheel in Tutankhamun's tomb, showing its consistency with the ancient Egyptian engineering. All indicators of this evidence point to an army that entered the Red Sea on dry land, but then met their demise. The wealth of archaeological evidence left behind is like a beacon pointing to the truth of this account. There simply are no other logical explanations. Further, it is clear evidence of a supernatural event that claimed the lives of thousands of Egyptian soldiers. As with the other pieces of the puzzle, they point to one thing: Darwinian science is in error, and the Bible is not. So far, all the evidence covered has been to substantiate the God of the Bible as the creator of the heavens and the earth, and as a God of miracles. While there is much more that could be covered, for the purposes of brevity and to keep this concise, we are going to move forward to one final event. For purposes of summary, if there is a God and He is the God of the Bible, that demands attention. If the events written in His Word occurred in the manner in which the Bible documents them, then that demands even further consideration. We are a generation where many are confused regarding the origins of life. Yet such a question is important. In fact, it is so important that it should be the burning question that must be answered within each one of us. Let me tell you why. If the Creator is the God of the Bible, then we must conclude that the Bible is in fact true. Not only is it true concerning creation and our origins, it is true concerning another critical point, namely, our need for a Savior. Genesis chapter 3 details an event that changed the future of all mankind. The decision Adam and Eve made to disobey their Creator not only had ramifications for them, but for all future generations. This decision was manifest in the first generation with Cain's murder of Abel, and it has been evident in our lives ever since. If there is a God, and it is the God of the Bible, then we know from the account that a fissure formed between God and man very early on. While we see the accounts of God walking through the Garden of Eden in perfect fellowship with Adam, all of that was erased with Adam's choice not to trust God at His word. But God had a plan to restore that which was lost. After all, if He is our Creator and He does want that kind of fellowship with man, He would have to have a plan. This brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. Did God have a plan? He sent His only begotten Son to do what no man could do. Jesus lived a life free from sin. He was always obedient to His Father in every word and in every deed. It's hard to imagine when we consider how early on we see the rebellion of babies and small children towards their parents. Yet Jesus was not made of the stuff we are made of, at least not entirely. While each and every one of us have an earthly father, He did not. Matthew 1:18 notes that Mary was impregnated by the Holy Spirit. In other words, God provided His seed, and it was out of this marriage with Mary's egg that Jesus was conceived. The blood of Adam, which was tainted through the curse emanating from the original sin in the garden, was not present in Him. Thus the statement, fully man and fully God, is an apt description. God's original creation in the Garden of Eden was untainted. In the same way, His Son Jesus was not tainted and therefore not a slave to sin. The existence and identity of Jesus is a widely debated topic. The reality is, he is the central point in so many of the questions we ask. He is the puzzle piece that ends all puzzles, and when he is fitted properly in our lives, we begin to see a more complete picture. Most historians agree there was a man named Jesus who fits the description. The question that continues to divide us is, who was he really? Some say that he is the Son of God. Others say that he was a great teacher and prophet. Personally, I find the latter to lack plausibility. The reason is simple. We cannot conclude that anyone who was either lying or confused about their identity was someone whose teachings should be honored. Clearly, Jesus claimed his identity as the Son of God. Was he telling the truth? And is there evidence that corroborates his statements? In short, the answer is yes. Biblical archaeologist Ron Wyatt either pioneered or was involved in each of the discoveries previously documented. This is important because the last claimed discovery of his we will be covering is that of the Ark of the Covenant and the blood of Jesus. If these previously covered discoveries accurately portray the historical and scriptural accounts, then it lends to his credibility in the area where the evidence is not so clear and apparent. Yet if Mr. Wyatt was accurate and forthright in the discovery of Noah's Ark, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Exodus evidence, then it makes this evidence noteworthy and, for some watching this short video, also life-changing. Before covering the claims of Ron Wyatt and the scientific testing of his apparent discovery of the Ark of the Covenant, it helps to have a bit of history for context. The Old Testament sacrificial system was methodical and based specifically on the instructions God gave Moses. The purpose was the temporal atonement for the sins of Israel. The priest assigned to the task would enter behind the curtain separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies and sprinkle blood onto the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. The key word is atonement. But the problem is, this was a temporary solution. More bulls and goats still needed to be sacrificed, and more blood was needed to be sprinkled on the mercy seat. But God had a plan for a sacrifice once and for all to cover all of mankind. Namely, that sacrifice was his son Jesus. His tomb has long been known and documented, but that is only part of the story. His sacrifice was not like the death of a martyr dying for a cause. They die and are laid to rest. Jesus' death was only the first chapter. What separates him from others who have died is that he was raised on the third day. So before going further, let's step back. The time is 586 BC, and the Babylonian army has surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Seeing that the fall of the city was evident, Jeremiah and some of his men were concerned with protecting the most valuable item within the city walls, the Ark of the Covenant. This item was highly prized by Israel, and as such was also highly prized by their enemies. Should Nebuchadnezzar's men have found it, it would have been the crown jewel of his conquest of this mighty city. Since the city was under siege, there was nowhere to take the ark, so Jeremiah chose to hide it. As far as we know, the ark was never seen again. Its location was a mystery, until the point when it was moved. The ark had rested in the Holy of Holies in the first temple, commonly referred to as Solomon's temple, since he was the one who undertook the task and oversaw its construction. According to the narrative, Jeremiah's men utilized the concealment of Zedekiah's cave, believed to have been Solomon's quarry for temple construction, to move the ark without drawing attention. This added concealment helped to ensure no unwanted disturbance of this most holy of artifacts to the people of Israel. Whether or not Jeremiah was aware of it, the choice of locations for the ark was no coincidence. So it was successfully hidden for thousands of years until, amazingly, Ron Wyatt was given express permission to complete an archaeological dig at the site God revealed to him. As was discovered, it was placed specifically in the location that God foreknew would be directly below the ultimate sacrifice of his own son. Rather than trying to explain this myself in secondhand, I want to share with you a brief clip where Ron Wyatt explains the results of his dig and what he discovered. This was from a Q&A session recorded back in the 1990s.
Dried blood is dead blood. Everybody knows that, all right? They can test the blood of the pharaohs, the mummies of the pharaohs, all right? There's certain things they can do. They cannot get a chromosome count by any method I'm familiar with, all right? Things keep changing. I don't profess to know everything. However, there's no way I know that you can get a chromosome count out of dead blood. You can get a DNA and some other things, but not a chromosome count, all right? That's done by living white blood cells. Now then, first of all, in this analysis, I took the blood into a laboratory in Israel. I asked one of the people I work with in antiquities, where is a good laboratory that does reliable work? And they said, such and such, such and such. I took it. I just said, please examine this blood and tell me what you can tell me about it. All right? They said, well, look, we're going to reconstitute it. We're going to put it in normal saline and keep it at body temperature for 72 hours with gentle swirling. All right, that's their business. That's great. I said, now I want to be there when you check it out. They said, fine. So I was back. They checked it out. I said, now, they said it's human blood. We can tell that. They did whatever tests they need to do. And then I said, take some of the white blood cells and put them in a growth medium and keep them at body temperature for 48 hours. And they said, well, that'll do no good because it's dead blood. I said, would you please do that for me? And they said, okay, we'll do it. So anyway, I said, I want to be there when you take it out and examine it. So I was back there. They took it out, examined it under a microscope, and the one technician called the other one over there, and then they called the boss over there, and they were talking Hebrew a mile a minute there for a little bit, and they looked at me and they said, Mr. Wyatt, this human blood only has 24 chromosomes in it. Everybody else has 46. You see, 23 from your mother, 23 from your father, 22 autosomes from your mother, 22 autosomes from your father. You get an X from your mother, you may get an X or Y from your father, all right? This blood had 23 chromosomes from the mother's side, one Y chromosome only. You see, the child could not have developed if they hadn't had the autosomes from the mother. So all of his physical characteristics were determined by his mother's side of the family, her autosomes. His maleness was determined by this one Y that came from the source, not a human male. Then they said, this blood is alive. And then they said, whose blood is this? I said, it's the blood of your Messiah. And I assure you, those men's lives have changed.
Later, Ron Wyatt would confirm that this was the Ark of the Covenant, and that the blood on the mercy seat was from someone who had only one human parent. There were no paternal chromosomes except for one Y chromosome. Jesus was God's only begotten Son, just as he said he was. Bible prophesied that Christ's blood would be sprinkled on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant, but as it was to be kept secret until our time, it was partially, but not totally, hidden in symbols. Matthew recorded an earthquake at the cross, which formed a crack in the ground below it. John tells us that when the Roman soldier pierced the side of Christ, blood and water ran out. The blood and water apparently ran down the earthquake crack. The prophet Isaiah wrote that Jesus, when he was bruised and broken, would sprinkle many nations. John reveals to us a secret. He tells us that the blood and water is here on earth as a testimony. And there are three that bear witness in earth: the Spirit, and the water, and the blood. And these three agree in one. If we receive the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. For this is the witness of God, which he hath testified of his Son. Right before the Babylonians besieged Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the ark was hidden. The very Ark of the Covenant, with the testimony of God, or the law, that the people had broken and that we need atoning for. God knew where Jesus was to suffer and die for humanity, and 600 years before the crucifixion, he hid the ark right under the Golgotha escarpment.
I've read the attacks that came against this finding, and I suppose it's not all that surprising. Yet when you take the facts and evidence leading up to this, why would someone with verifiable proof of so many major events in biblical history lie about this one? We're not talking about a single puzzle piece, but many pieces put together and placed on display for all who are willing to honestly consider them. There is the matter of evidence, and there is the matter of faith. At some point, we must make a decision as to whether we will take the leap of faith based on the facts and evidence portrayed. Before concluding, there is one more piece of evidence to introduce. It was not intended, probably because the amount of controversy surrounding it. Yet after spending hours researching the topic, I reached a conclusion. This piece of evidence is authentic. It is only fair that any piece of evidence should be corroborated by multiple sources, and although this evidence is different, it relates to the same historical event. That piece of evidence is the Shroud of Turin. As with other items covered in this video, there simply isn't enough time for complete and comprehensive coverage. There is, however, sufficient time to introduce the facts and evidence and encourage you, the watcher, to research it further yourself. It will be no surprise to you that this shroud, believed by many to be the burial shroud of Christ, is widely debated from the standpoint of its authenticity. It is for this very reason that it was never a consideration for this video up until this point. Honestly, it was my opinion coming into the subject that it would be readily disproven and I could simply move on. The evidence tells a different story. The first thing noteworthy is that the appearance of the face within the shroud is that of a Jew. The second thing worthy of noting is the blood evidence on the shroud, which is authentic. The third thing is that no one to this day has fully offered an explanation as to how it was created. More specifically, how it could have been created as a forgery. Sure, there are many who seek to discredit this artifact, but they have ultimately failed. So rather than going into detail based on my limited understanding, I'm going to turn this topic over to an expert. Barry Schwartz was part of the original team that examined the shroud starting in 1978. I won't tell his story for him, rather you should hear it for yourself. Clearly, what he found changed his life, and it may just change yours as well.
Thank you. Well, as you've heard, I was the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Shroud of Turin Research Project was the first and only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth examination of the Shroud of Turin. Now, I have to tell you that I just finished a 6-week lecture tour, 3 states, 12 cities, 22 lectures, all of them 2 hours or more, and all of them extemporaneous. I often do 8-hour seminars on the Shroud of Turin. Again, no notes, no lecture notes of any kind, but 15 minutes is hard. And so you'll have to forgive me, but there was no way that I could do this. You know, it's not hard to get me to start talking, but it's hard to get me to stop. So you'll forgive me that I brought some notes with me, and I'm going to have to refer to them just so that I stay on time and make sure that I do it correctly. So there it is. That's that piece of cloth that got into my life 35 years ago. Well, as a professional photographer, I specialized in scientific, medical, and technical kinds of issues. So I had the skills and the qualifications that were necessary to be a part of the team that examined the shroud. But when they, excuse me, when they first asked me to do this, first thing I said was, no, no way. And why did I refuse? Well, the answer is simple. I was very uncomfortable with the subject matter because I was born and raised in an Orthodox Jewish home. Now, I want to be clear about that. I am not a practicing Jew at this point in my life, but I was for that first 13 years. Both my parents immigrated to America from Poland, and when they were little kids, just before World War II. And so my question, and the question that went through my mind at the time, was why would a Jewish man want to get involved with this, what is probably, arguably, the most important relic of Christianity? At that moment in my life, I couldn't see any benefit to being involved. Well, not only that, I was a total skeptic and figured that the shroud was probably some form of a painting, which was the conventional wisdom in 1978. I fully expected to get to Turin, take a quick look, see the paint and the brushstrokes, and go home. I even stupidly said that publicly somewhere. And of course, for the last 35 years, I've been living to regret those words. Anyway, in the end, I viewed this whole thing, and this is terrible to admit this close to the Vatican, this was going to be a free trip to Italy. That's what I thought. But, you know, my attitude was immature because I was only 32 years old at the time. My son just turned 33, and I'm still waiting for him to grow up. So, so I can imagine where I can't even imagine where my head was in those days. In the end, of course, I did join the team because the image on the shroud has some fascinating properties that piqued my scientific curiosity. But I still tried to quit twice again. And in fact, as our team grew, a few men from the Jet Propulsion Labs became members of our team. One of them was a man named Don Lind, may he rest in peace. Don was an imaging expert from NASA, so he was my hero immediately. And he was the head of imaging on Voyager and Viking and Mariner and Galileo. You might have heard of some of them. So I am pretty sure that any professional photographer given that opportunity would have been honored to be a member of that team. But I remember asking Don at one point during our planning, we planned for 19 months before we came to Turin to examine the shroud. I remember asking him, I said, Don, what's a nice Jewish boy like me doing on this team? And Don, who was a good Catholic, looked me right in the eye and he said, have you forgotten that the man in question was a Jew? And I said, no, Don, that's probably the only thing I knew about Jesus, that he was a Jew. And then he said, and of course this is where Don, I think God was speaking to me through his lips, he looked at me and he said, oh, so you don't think God would want one of his chosen people on our team? And I laughed. I said, no, Don, I never thought that. And so then Don gave me what perhaps may be the best advice I've ever been given. He said, Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know. You know, and on those words, I stayed on that team, because truer and more profound words have never been spoken. Don was right, and I've never regretted taking advice and staying on that team. Now, the tests we performed went on over the years that we did it and then evaluated it, went on to ultimately prove that the shroud was not a painting, not a scorch, or not a photograph. These were the kind of conventional wisdom things that people had, and so all the tests that we planned basically were to test for those kinds of things. At the end of our team, at the end of our 3 years, we published our work in peer-reviewed scientific journals, credible ones, I might add. Now with the internet, we have journals that are, the only thing they review is your check to make sure it clears, and they're not exactly a high standard as the ones that we had to deal with. But ideally, we went there to answer the question, how is the image formed? That was our primary purpose. And in the end, however, we could not determine an image formation mechanism that could make an image with the properties on the Shroud of Turin. Our collective work still forms the primary database of literature that exists in the peer-reviewed science that points to the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. However, even with all that, it still took another 18 years before I was convinced. I'm not a fast sell. But in 1995, after years of actually resistance on my part, world-renowned blood expert Dr. Alan Adler, who was truly maybe the foremost blood expert in the world, and also Jewish, I might add, was on the phone with me, and he answered the final question that had kept me from accepting the shroud as authentic. I was on the phone with him. I wasn't convinced the shroud was real because the blood on the shroud is still red. And old blood is supposed to turn black or brown, sometimes just within a matter of hours. And that really stopped me. Al then looked at me over the phone. He didn't look at me, but he spoke to me and he said, Barry, he said, I'd found this large amount of bilirubin in the blood. Now, somebody who's been tortured, like Jesus was, beaten the night before in the Garden of Gethsemane, then the next day scourged and ultimately capped with a capper crown of thorns, ultimately crucified and speared. People who have been tortured that way usually go into shock. The liver floods the bloodstream with bilirubin, and Al told me that blood of that nature stays red forever. Suddenly and unexpectedly, I realized that the last bit of evidence had come in, and I had no choice but to accept that the shroud was authentic. I immediately kind of remember, I was a big Arthur Conan Doyle fan when I was young, and I remember Conan Doyle once said through the lips of Sherlock Holmes, if you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, is most likely the truth. Then I remembered Occam's razor. Occam's razor is that the simplest answer is most likely the correct one. So I was left with only one conclusion, that this cloth could only be the authentic burial shroud of the historic Jesus. It was even a surprise to me. I was shocked. Because after all those years of resistance, you know, you think, well, I'm finished with this. That wasn't to be the case. Now, over the years, over all those years, I'd noticed that the media reports on the shroud were often misleading or even completely false. And I'd been privileged to study it firsthand. And I had access to what I ultimately realized was inside information. So I knew the truth about the shroud. And because of my media experience, I knew better than to believe the nonsense I was reading in the paper. Now, there were probably 1 billion people on this planet who had more right to be in that room than I did. And yet, there I was in 1978, God dragging me, kicking and screaming, keeping me on that team. And at that moment in time, I realized that it brought with it a great responsibility, this privilege I had been given. And it was something of an epiphany because I finally came to realize that I wasn't in that room for me. I was in that room for you. Now, I knew the truth about the shroud and was frustrated because my Christian brothers and sisters were not getting that truth. And to me, all of our team members had always been doing this simply about the truth. Now, in 1996, I got a phone call, and I apologize to the interpreter, this isn't in the script. I got a phone call from a friend, and my friend said, "You know that shroud thing that you're involved with?" And I said, "Yeah, I know that shroud thing that I'm involved with." And he said, "Well, you know, it turns out that's a photograph made by Leonardo da Vinci." Leonardo da Vinci. And, you know, I'm not an expert in history. We had some real historians that we worked with, and I always left it to them. But I remember saying to him, at first I thought he was joking, but then I realized he was serious, so I said, "Excuse me, but where did you get that information?" And he said, "Well, my wife and I were checking out at the grocery store, and there on one of the counters was a tabloid, the Inquirer. And I had this epiphany, as I mentioned, and I realized that the public just doesn't have access." So, at that moment in time, I built Shroud.com, which has since become the oldest, largest, and most extensive resource on the internet. We just celebrated our 17th anniversary, and although that says 3.8 million, we're well over 4 million since I wrote this, put that slide in this lecture. And so we had our 17th anniversary this year, and I also got about, I'm thinking 1,000 emails a day now, some days a little less. I was on CNN a few weeks ago, a couple thousand emails came in, so it's turned into a full-time job. Anyway, and as a matter of fact, people often say, "Hey, you know you're number one on Google." And my answer is always the same. You know, we're 5 years older than Google. Because we are. Most importantly, I guess, now I realize that this work is the fulfillment of that obligation that I felt that came with the great privilege that I was given in 1978. And in the end, it's also become my legacy. I've had a long career and done a lot of stuff. But it's come and it's gone, and it really means nothing. And now I'm doing something that in the end will live beyond me. That means my grandchildren maybe can show their grandchildren something their great-grandpa did back in the old days. Anyway, in 2009, I formed the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, or STERA Inc. That's a nonprofit organization. For 14 years, I supported the website myself, and it eventually got to be a point where I needed to go nonprofit. I think a lot of people, and I'm going to be candid, a lot of people may have been a little suspicious of my motives. You know, a Jewish guy, and I'm actually permitted to sell things, photographs of the shroud. No offense, I'm not offended by that, I understand. And so I formed STERA Inc. to help preserve this information, to support the website, so that in the future researchers will have the opportunity to have access to the materials that we collected and I've collected since, so that future research on the shroud doesn't have to start from scratch again. And that ensures they'll remain free to everyone. Still no advertising on shroud.com. Now, there's our page. I'm sorry I'm a little behind. Now, in case you missed it, that's the topic I'm supposed to be talking about. I know it hasn't seemed like that at all yet. Now, the problem I have is that I'm not really a scientist myself. I'm a technical photographer. So I cannot speak for the world of science in general in addressing this issue. Although I personally believe, and this is my personal point of view, that science is simply man's attempt to understand God's creation. That's the way I see it. So in this particular lecture, I can only share my personal point of view with you about this specific project, and that's how I used to look. Notice that there was a lot more hair. Well, I still have a lot, it's just slid down the back a bit. And it has changed color a tad. So, I can start by telling you that, first of all, the church was very gracious from the first day. and in no way interfered with our scientific work. They even allowed us to own and keep the data we collected, which is why I'm permitted to make copies and make photographs of the shroud available. But the STIRP team member who really put it into the right words was Dr. John Heller, also gone now. He put it far more eloquently in his 1983 book about our team, and I'm just going to quote him. He said, "Though it was believed that there would be a confrontation between science and religion, none occurred. Rather, the relationship was harmonious and synergistic." So there was never a conflict between our team and the authorities in Turin or faith in general. Now, I'm sure that's an important part of why our team, in the end, was so successful. Now, in the end, however, I consider myself kind of a living example of religious freedom in scientific research. In my 35-year involvement with the Shroud, I've always been treated with great respect by not only Christians, but Muslims and Jews alike. All have shown an understanding and a consideration of my position, somewhat unique, I might add. And even the atheists and skeptics that I often will debate on TV shows and radio shows show a grudging respect for me. I guess they have come to understand that I'm only telling the truth. Ironically, I now teach a course at the Athenaeum. Imagine that, a Jewish man teaching future priests about the Shroud of Turin. Thanks, Father Guerra, I know you're out there somewhere, the man who organized this event. Although he did come to my house and spend 3 days there checking me out. I'm sure he did, and you can ask him later. Anyway, but the story doesn't really end there. Shortly after building the website and stating publicly that I believed the Shroud was authentic, based on the scientific evidence, people started asking me a new question. And you know what that question was? What do you believe? They were asking about my faith. Well, at age 50, I was forced for the first time as an adult to confront my own beliefs about God. I'd walked away from Judaism when I was 13. That's me. That's my bar mitzvah picture, you know, the one that mothers hang on their walls to this day. 55 years later, it's still hanging on my mother's wall. But at age 13, I walked away from Judaism and never looked back. God was not a part of my life. I never even thought about religion. Now, at age 50, I was being forced to confront that which I had avoided most of my adult life. Now, I was raised in a very traditional Orthodox Jewish home. Both my parents, born in Poland, grandparents lived with us, 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of silverware, Orthodox Jewish home. And so I had to look in my own heart for the first time. And I had rejected all that before, but I did look into my heart, and to my shock, I found that God had been there all along, just waiting for me to look and acknowledge him. So, with that knowledge, I'd rediscovered my own faith. It only took, 50 years? Better late than never, I guess. And it's still hard for me to believe that 35 years have passed, and now I'm called an expert on the Shroud of Turin. How did that happen? This was not my idea. I didn't decide to do this. Like I said earlier, I was dragged along kicking and screaming. I didn't want to do this. And yet, here I am. I'm standing in the Vatican, addressing this audience. Unbelievable. Of course, over the years, the Shroud has brought me to places I never thought I would be. Last year, I lectured on the Shroud of Turin in the little village in Poland where my mother was born. Now, ironically, that little village in Poland has this little Catholic church, and my mother left at age 7, and when I asked her, before I went to that village to kind of find my roots, I said, "What do you remember of that village?" And that little girl, that little Jewish girl, her fondest recollection of the little village of Wiśnice in Poland was the Catholic Church that was down by the river. So last year I lectured in that church and called her and I said, "Where do you think I am?" She said, "Well, you're in Poland." I said, "No, but where specifically?" "Well, I don't know. I'm in that little church that you remembered." Now, what an awesome opportunity. And yet, none of that could have happened if it weren't for the Shroud of Turin. Later this year, I'm going to make my first trip to Jerusalem. Now, for years, my friends and colleagues have all said to me, "Barry, when are you going to go to Israel?" And my answer has always been the same. If God wants me to go, he'll arrange it. Well, ironically, I'm going to jump ahead. Ironically, guess who's the one who arranged it? And isn't it ironic for a Jew to go to the Holy Land for the first time in his life, and it's arranged by a Catholic priest? Well, not just any Catholic priest, that one. So, I'm really honored to be a part of that, and Father Guerra is my friend and my brother, and is responsible for bringing me here. Now, I truly believe that only God would think to choose a Jewish man who had no emotional attachment to Jesus, who was a total skeptic, and with a pretty negative attitude, I might add, and put him on that team. Now, ironically, I'd learned as a child that the Jews were a chosen people. I've heard that since I was a little kid. I never felt very chosen. But now I do. Because of the shroud, for the first time in my life, I get it. And yet, all God asked me to do, and it was very simple, tell the truth, Barry. Now, if God had said to me, "Barry, go out and make up stories to convince people that the shroud's authentic," I would have failed. In Vancouver, British Columbia, 2 years ago, a gentleman came up after one of my lectures, one of my extemporaneous 2-hour lectures, I might add, and he looked me right in the eye and he says, "Mr. Schwartz, that was a great lecture, you know, but you'll never convince me." And I looked him right in the eye and I said, "Well, what makes you think I even care what you believe? That's between you and God. Take it up with him." And so that's when I realized that the idea of trying to convince people is not a good idea. Now, I'm sure in the early days, I probably tried. But now, I just put the facts out there and let people decide for themselves. Now, I usually end my lectures by answering the question that I posed kind of at the beginning: what's a Jewish man like me doing involved with the most important relic for Christianity? Why? Well, it took me a long time to figure out the answer. But now it's obvious. God wanted me to do it. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? I'm the messenger. So with that thought, all I can say, how many Jews can claim that it was the Shroud of Turin that brought them back to their faith in God? I can. So with that, all I can say is, if I'm not an example of religious freedom and scientific research, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry.
Why is it that all these findings are not on the evening news for the world to see? The answer to that question is self-evident. We have two competing systems and two competing schools of thought. Only one of them is presently controlling the minds of this world by distorting the truth and by suppressing such facts and evidence and presenting their own contrived narrative. An assurance I have for you is that a day is coming where the whole world will know the truth. Sadly, for many, it will come at such a time where there are no decisions left to be made. Eternal destiny is decided by one question and one question alone. Are you covered by the blood of Jesus? Now for the good news. That day of which I speak has not yet come. On this day, you have been presented with a lot of information. The facts and evidence point towards several key points. In summary, these are: 1. In the argument between Darwinian science and creation as presented in the Bible, only one can be true. I believe the facts and evidence points towards an intelligent creator. 2. The identity of this creator is substantiated by the accuracy of his testimony as presented in the Bible. Interestingly, it is not just the Bible that has narratives that are similar, if not identical, meaning that these historical events have been noted by those who are not of Jewish and Christian backgrounds. The facts and evidence substantiate that these events did occur, and while there are other texts that cover them, the only text that covers each and every one of them is the Bible. So the identity of this creator is the God of the Bible. 3. With the Bible having been substantiated in natural and supernatural events, one must conclude the other information presented within the written word is also accurate, namely that it is evidence for fallen man and evidence for a Savior which we find in Christ Jesus. And 4. There are certain supernatural aspects of Jesus' death and resurrection that cannot be explained away by science. Just as Pharaoh's magicians attempted to duplicate each of the plagues inflicted on Egypt prior to the Exodus, there comes a point where no man-made or supernatural entity apart from that of the God of the Bible can be used to explain them. Whether you scoff at what has been presented or put in your due diligence into this matter is entirely up to you. Be prepared for the fact that you will find competing theories, but realize that only one of them will be true. Which is a decision for you to make. I am simply pointing and presenting the facts and evidence as I have poured hundreds of hours into researching them so that you can have a basis by which to reach your conclusions. Perhaps this evidence is compelling enough. Perhaps you are ready to make a leap of faith right now. By all means, if that is the case, I don't want to leave you here. I want to pray a simple prayer and invite you to join me in it. Today may very well be the day that changes your life forever. God, I have always wanted to know the truth, and yet I have never quite been satisfied. Yet on this day, as I am confronted with it, I have made a decision. I believe that you are the creator of the heavens and the earth. I believe that you performed miraculous signs and wonders as presented in the biblical narrative. I believe that you sent your one and only Son, Jesus, to die on my behalf. I forsake my old life, my sins, and my rebellion against you. I ask that you forgive me for the wrongs I have committed, the words I have spoken against you, and the ways that I have embraced rebellion against you. Jesus, I ask that you come into my heart. I ask that you be the Lord of my life. I give myself fully unto you without coercion or reservation. Thank you for the cross, Jesus, and that you laid your life down for me. If you just prayed this prayer with me, you may be wondering what to do next. First, get a Bible and read it. Second, find a local Bible-preaching, Bible-believing fellowship you can plug into. You may find that you are coming in with information that even seasoned Christians never knew. Lastly, if you need prayer, you are welcome to reach out to me. I'll be glad to pray with you, and if you like, you can email me. My email address is listed right here. For those who already had a personal relationship with Jesus based on faith, but without this information, I encourage you, in fact, I implore you to share this video. Who knows who within your personal circles will finally see the truth so that it can set them free. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.